Hello, I'm Jim Cornwall, and this is the WalkingPost.com podcast. WalkingPost.com is the news website dedicated to walking, with all the latest on gear, books, trails, festivals, fitness, health, events, and more. This podcast is number 31, and it's going out on October the 17th. I'm just back from a trip to Gothenburg where I was doing interviews for a biotech podcast. I've been to Sweden plenty of times, but never to Gothenburg. It's a really nice place, definitely worth a visit. I think the two highlights were seeing allegedly the world's biggest cinnamon buns, and the other highlight was seeing a Reliant Robin. It had no lights on, it was doing about 15 miles an hour, and clearly there was something wrong with it because the screeching noise coming from it sounded like an old airplane trying to take off and failing. I managed to get a couple of long walks in, including the first couple of stages of the Gotteleden, a long-distance trail that starts outside the tourist office in the middle of the city, and which goes past the stadium and into the suburbs very quickly. There are some signs, but strangely, in a couple of places, they disappear. And of course it's in places where you need them. So I ended up walking up a hill for about a quarter of a mile before looking at the map on my phone and realised I'd overshot the turn. That happened twice, so if you are going to do that trail, I would take a map with you. But it's definitely a beautiful walk. About 20 minutes after leaving the centre of the city, a woodpecker flew right by me, and what also amazed me was the number of people using the facilities in the forest. They have disc golf in there, and people were actually using it. There were dozens of families using the mountain bike trails, and those exercise stations that you see were all full of people actually using the equipment and exercising. So definitely a trail I'd like to revisit and complete in its entirety. Easily doable in about 5 days, and there are places to stay along the route. Not sure I'd do it in January though, but who knows. At least it will be quiet. On a personal level, I also found quite a lot of used CDs in the charity shops, and one of those charity shops was like a department store. It was across 4 floors. Anyway, I digress as always. Because of being away, I'm now miles behind on everything else, but we do have an interview, and it isn't from Sweden. I do have lots of interviews from Sweden, but they're all on biotech, and that's not really appropriate for this podcast. Let's move on and see what's special about October the 17th. It is Pasta Day, Clean Your Virtual Desktop Day, which I could use. It's also International Day for the Eradication of Poverty, and I hope all those multi-millionaires are taking note. It's also Loud Shirt Day, something that I used to do quite often when I was in a band, and now not so much. For me, loud now means 2 colours, or maybe a logo. It's the day of the first Open Golf Championship, which I know about because I walk past the sign quite often in Prestwick. When you look through all the things that happen today, it's generally related to war and disasters, unfortunately. And if today's your birthday, you share it with Evel Knievel and George Wendt, who was, among other things, Norm in Cheers. Anyway, to this week's podcast. Last time we had a conversation with Oisin Lennon, CEO of Danu Sports in Dublin. This week we're talking about a book covering the Yukon Quest in Canada. Before we get going, if you do have news, guest ideas, or even subjects to cover, or comments, or you want to advertise, please do get in touch via walkingpost.com, or just email me at jim@walkingpost.com. No articles you may have missed section on the podcast this week because of being away. It will be back next week. So let's move on. Right, this week we're talking to the author Mark Hines, an endurance athlete whose books document long-distance expeditions in demanding environments. In Hiking the Yukon Quest, he recounts walking the 1,000-mile trail that links Fairbanks, Alaska in the US with Whitehorse in the Canadian territory of the Yukon. Hi Mark, thanks for being with us today. Maybe you could give me a bit of background on what you do and also what led you to being in Canada in the first place, maybe.
Sure. I got into ultra endurance racing a long time ago, and that was just off the back of seeing something on television and thinking, oh, I'll have a go at that, which took me to the Sahara Desert, and then finished a 7-day race there and heard about a race in the Amazon and went and did that one. And by the time I'd gone out there, I'd heard about this race in the Yukon in Canada, so I'd already signed up for that. So as soon as I returned from the Amazon, I was training for the race in Canada. I competed in that and I absolutely fell in love with it up there, the Yukon, the history, the wilderness, all of it just came together. The first time I raced there, it was 430 miles. It was a race that had been attempted 2 years before, but the temperatures got very low. They'd held the race up somewhere, so no one had finished it. So I was fairly anxious going in the first time, thinking no one's actually completed this distance before. They've done shorter races there. So I was very cautious and also didn't really know what to expect from that environment. So the first time was easy going, and I went back afterwards to really compete and ended up doing that race 3 times. And that race is along the course of what's considered to be the toughest sled dog race in the world, which is the Yukon Quest, which starts either in Whitehorse or Fairbanks, goes through Dawson City and finishes either in Fairbanks or Whitehorse, depending on the year. So I'd done half of it, the Canadian side, 3 times. I wanted to see what I'd been missing out on. So went out to Fairbanks and started from there. Yeah, that was getting somewhere around 1,000 miles of trail in total, half and half, Alaska and Canada.
The obvious question is, having spent 30 some winters in Canada, you can't really train in England for that kind of weather. How did you approach that?
One of the good things, I suppose, in a strange way, is that the body doesn't really adapt to the cold. We adapt to the heat really efficiently. It takes about a week, and all sorts of cool physiological responses happen, like our sweating becomes more efficient, we become more tolerant of the heat and so on. But in the cold, very little happens, and what does happen takes a long time. So many of the differences between people like me who had no background out there beforehand and couldn't really train in the cold environment before, and the people who lived there, was largely just psychological differences. So when I did the races, the British and lots of the European races often did better than the local races, because the locals would just identify when conditions were getting bad and think, oh no, this is rough, we don't want to be out in this. And they just quit the race for another year, go back home and put their feet up in front of the fire. Whereas the Brits and Europeans, especially the Brits, had absolutely no idea that it was bad. We just thought, well, it's going to be colder than what we're used to, and didn't really know how to gauge it beyond that. So we'd kind of get through on our ignorance, just sort of taking us through, thinking, oh, it's probably normal, it's probably all right, and we've got our big coats. So for me, getting through the races and then getting through this solo 1,000-miler, a lot of it just came down to accumulated experiences of things perhaps going wrong and me working out how to keep being able to make progress. But the actual cold side of it was more just about managing the equipment. So knowing when you put a big coat on, when you need to put the mittens on, when you take shorter breaks, how you manage food in that environment, because you can't just sort of stop and have a nice relaxing half hour over a meal if it's minus 40 or minus 50. So there's lots of streamlining that happens, and just an awareness of when it's cold, how cold you allow, say, fingers to get before you have to say, okay, no, you've got to move on, or you've got to try something else. Put on the big mittens or put in some hand warmer pads, things like that. So yeah, can't really train for the cold, but I think there's an accumulated experience of being out there that you call upon that comes back to you quite quickly.
Self-preservation in a lot of cases, I think.
Yeah, yeah. Nothing beats that first 24 hours of coming from the UK and just stepping out to -20 or -30 or something, because it's such a shock. And about the only adaptation that's going to happen is that you feel a little bit more comfortable during that first 24 hours. You just sort of accept that that's what the temperature is. Your core temperature can drop a little bit and it just becomes normal for you. I did a journey right up on the Arctic Ocean years ago where I flew out to this northernmost town on continental US. And just that first day, I had to go around some local shops. But I was walking in there with my big coat, the hood up, the mittens on, everything's completely protecting me. And I just sort of walk into the shop like their equivalent of a Halfords and just hold my hand up to the staff and just like, just give me a moment while I, take all of this off, because I was an absolute scene walking in there, just coming in, and everyone else was just walking around in fairly light jackets, just normal gloves and so on. But it's just that first day, and after that, I was just like them, jacket open, not wearing the big mittens and so on. But yeah, it's once you know it happens, it's fine.
How did that then translate into writing about it?
So when I did the desert race, I wrote about that, and it was actually quite a useful way of getting sponsorship. So essentially, I wrote about the desert race, and I had a kit list in the back of the book saying this is what worked for me, and so then I could take that to sponsors. There was Salomon and some others, and say, well, I'm going to do this race in the jungle. Is there any chance of some shoes and some kit for it? And they said, well, yeah, sure, just do the same thing again, just put your kit list in there, which I did. And then for the Yukon, I mean, the kit list just was absolutely crazy compared to those other races. It's still fast and light, but you're fast and light with a jacket that weighs a kilo, a sleeping bag that weighs a kilo and a half. It's all on a sled, and so much equipment, so much weight to equipment, and food as well. So lots of things to spend money on. And again, using the book was a good way to attract sponsors. So it did facilitate that. It was useful. And then over the years, I just became very picky about what equipment I was going to use. Sponsors ended up getting dropped because I wanted a bit more freedom to use whatever I wanted, and still work with a few. But now I just write because I really enjoy it. My first book was awful. You show a book to friends, and they all tell you it's great, either because they don't read or they just don't want to hurt your feelings. And then you publish something, and then honest people give you some feedback. And you think, well, I wish I had this earlier. So yes, I developed. I'm actually on the third edition of the Desert book now. That's just come out, and the difference between the first and second editions were huge, in that there was actually some writing style in the second one rather than just an account. And then I really leaned into that and started sort of developing that style. And you can't please everyone still, and as a writer, you don't want to, because I think that the style wouldn't work. You can't appeal to everyone. We've all got different tastes, and we know what we like. So what happened over the initial years of writing was that I gathered sort of this hardcore group of people who really, really liked my books, and they liked the style that was in there. And so that's what I leaned into. So, well, if people are enjoying it, that's the audience I'm writing for. So I'll keep doing that, and I'll try and make that better. When I wrote the book about the 1,000 miles in the Yukon, I sent that to a friend of mine who's a journalist, but he became my friend because he read my books beforehand, especially one that I'd written on my Yukon race. Then he came out to do a course that I teach in Scotland for people who want to go to the Yukon to do this race and get some preparation and some practical skills. He came on that course, and now he is one of my honest reviewers, and go through and put lines through my favourite bits. Then yeah, he loved that Yukon book. So I made some refinements, and then that's sort of the journey of the writing, really. It was working out how to get honest feedback, but also the importance of having a writing style rather than just writing accounts.
I've bought a few books from Amazon over the years on adventure travel and hiking, walking, and the ones that have 5 stars, I think generally the first 20 reviews are all from friends of the author, because you see all of these 5-star reviews. You buy the book and it's horrendous.
Yeah.
So it's quite interesting looking at
Yes.
some of those.
Yeah. Yeah. You learn the most from the negative reviews. It's from my improved desert book. Most of the reviews are very, very positive, which is great. But there'll be the odd one now that will be like, oh, this reads like a novel. It's like a story rather than he wanted an instruction manual. It's like, well, that's fine. I'm not writing an instruction manual. In the next edition, I'll just make it really clear in the beginning that this isn't an instruction manual. It's a personal account of my experience doing this race for the first time, which people can learn from. But, there's enough content online that will give instructions on how to do things. So that's not why you write books usually, not books that people want to read. But yeah, I'm sure for my Yukon book, the first 20 reviews will be friends who like me, and I hope that they will write positive reviews because they like the book, not just because they're my friends. But they'll be the first ones to buy it, which is why they'll also want to support me and do the reviews. But that's really useful in getting more people to buy the book. But then I hope that the reviews stay positive on the most part because they think it's a good book and don't actually care about my feelings. Just think that it's a book worth reading. That'd be nice anyway.
And I think you also touched on something else that was interesting and very true, is that if you write a book like a field guide, it's factual. And so there's not really any room for a lot of personality to come through in that. But when you're writing a book like this, and again, having read lots of this kind of book, some people concentrate on the minutiae of the trip. My feet hurt. I needed a plaster. My toenail fell off, and they go into great depth on this is what I ate, and that becomes, after the third day, becomes a little bit mundane. But then you get the ones that are extremely descriptive to the point that that's all it is just flowery language. And then you get people who clearly their interest is history, so they write about all of the history things. It's very difficult, I think, and I wonder how you approached it to get a balance of not just appealing to a very tiny niche, but then also not developing it to the point where you're trying to appeal to everyone.
Yeah, it is the challenge to get that balance right. And I feel that there's so much content already available. If you want to know about the history of the place, there's plenty of websites that will focus on the history specifically. So for this event in the Yukon, or this trail, it commemorates the gold rush that happened in Dawson City in the 1890s. And lots of people made these incredible journeys there. If people had money, they came along the Yukon River. So they went up the coast, mostly from San Francisco. So go into Canada, get the gold, bring it back, and improve the wealth of the US. People were traveling from San Francisco up the coast and then coming along the Yukon River. So they were all on boats the whole way. And if you had money, that's exactly what you'd do. If you didn't have money, you'd only go up as far as Skagway, and then you'd come across the White Mountains, and there'd be these incredible stories of hardship. People had to bring in huge quantities of kit and food with them that was checked at the border. And it was just horrible. There were just so many incredible accounts of people and horses dying just on this initial 60 odd miles crossing the mountains. And they get to Whitehorse and they'd build rafts to continue along the river, and a lot of the rafts would get broken up almost instantly when they reached the first rapids, and then they'd be on foot. And they'd even be told, oh, you can hike it in a season. And some people will be out there for years trying to reach Dawson City going along this trail. So the history was actually with me all the way through, and it would have been missing something not to acknowledge that at points as you go through, because you go along, you think, oh, I'm going along the Yukon River now. People would have done this on paddle steamers. If they had money, they would have seen the same mountains, the same trees, and all the rest. And there was that. And then you're on the other side of Dawson, going on the overland section through Canada, and you think, well, I've got my big jacket, I've got my mittens, I've got all this specialist gear with me. I'm feeling the temperature the same way that people would have done during the gold rush, but it's completely different in terms of I'm so secure, and I know I can call help if anything goes wrong, and all of these layers that just weren't there. So it frames it to some extent, but there are already books about the gold rush, so you can't do it entirely on that. And then, yeah, as you say, you could describe every meal you're having and just, yeah, every feeling that you're experiencing. And yeah, that sort of an account becomes, I think, very dry very quickly. But again, it needs to be in there to some extent. One of the challenges with what I'm doing is I want it to appeal to as many people as possible. But my background from coming through the races and doing this with a sled, and I'm wearing trail shoes, it could be -50 and I'm wearing what appeared to be a pair of trainers. And that's absolutely appropriate because I'm moving fast. My body and my feet are generating plenty of heat. So it's not an issue unless I stop for a long time. But even locals get confused about that because they mostly just walk around from a heated home to a heated car to a heated place of work, or they're on their skidoos which have got heating blasting over their feet, and they're still wearing these huge bulky insulating boots because they're not moving their feet, so they just want to retain heat. But you couldn't walk very far in those without getting blisters and all sorts of issues. So it's things like that that I sometimes forget isn't obvious to someone who has a hiking background, but they've never pulled a sled for 40 miles a day or whatever in snow and icy conditions. But at the same time, there are people who have come from the racing background who know exactly what that's like, and I can't spend pages and pages going through it. So I have to try and get the information across so it's accessible to people and I'm not alienated readers without really laboring points and boring people to tears and detracting from the story as well, with that sort of information. So it has to sort of be in there. And something that comes up in that book on a couple of occasions, possibly 3 occasions, is me ranting about people I've met who have just infuriated me with their ignorance. Because the first person was someone who was a musher for the dog race. So he'd competed in the Yukon Quest and finished before and done very well. And then he was in as an official, and I met him at one of the race checkpoints. So I was doing it solo, but I left a week ahead of the dogs. So they were overtaking me at some point, and I was in amongst all of that race infrastructure, and I was meeting people. Some of them I'd met before, and some of them just, the first thing they'll do is they'll look at your feet. Or this person had commented that there's not much sympathy, people going out into the wilderness here, staying in a bus, for example, hunting moose and dying while you're out there. And so they're referring to sort of these folklores, these stories, and having these incredible assumptions that because I was out there on foot, I was doing something I had no experience of. Whereas this was a musher. He knew exactly what the environment was like. And he must have known there was a race that took place for people on foot. And he could have just considered that I've already done 300 miles. And this wasn't my first rodeo as it was. I'd already done thousands and thousands of miles in other races and expeditions. But just this immediate thought of, I'm not going to try and understand what I'm looking at. I'm just going to reject it. So that sort of thing I, again, leaned into as an opportunity to kind of show that there is this ignorance. It's not just from people who have no experience of what that cold is like, because they're used to English winters or European winters. Like even people who live out there are unaware of how other people spend their time for leisure. So it was really mixed. It was things like that. It was one person told me, well, he looked at my water bladder, so a 3-litre water bladder, which I would wear between my base layer, and I had like a mid-layer jacket that was fairly insulated, but it was very breathable. So the bladder is getting all this heat from my body as I'm moving. And he looked at it and he said, oh, that won't work up here. By this point, I've done over 500 miles, and it'd gone down below -40. And again, I've done thousands of miles in other events. So how does someone kind of just make these comments based on the sort of a knee-jerk reaction without trying to understand the person? And so I'd see people like that, and I would really just rant and paragraph and paragraph, which I kind of put in there as a fun element, but also just the frustrations of people not really understanding what they were seeing. And then I would speak to other people who have lived out there their whole lives who would say, well, yeah, of course, children walk to school wearing plimsolls, or the local indigenous population wear mucklucks, which are fur based and sort of leather sole, but they're very thin. And again, it's walking around and you generate heat. So yeah, you'd have both. You'd have the people who understand and the people who don't, and you don't want to alienate people back home. So you just sort of have some fun. There were lots of different elements that I tried to put in, but the main thing I wanted to get across actually was the beauty of the environment I was moving through. That's why I go out there all the time, and it's for that and that aloneness and enjoying it.
You've been to the Yukon several times. Even a lot of people within Canada, along that 90% of the population lives within about 100 miles of the US border. So there's probably at least 60 or 70% of Canadians would never have been to any of the territories. They often, even within Canada, think that it's just a frozen white wasteland. What was it, or what is it that attracts you to that kind of landscape?
And that's, yeah, such an interesting point because I have a Yukon friend whose job it is to try and encourage other Canadians to go to the Yukon. And he says, yeah, it's frozen in the winter and in the summer it's just full of mosquitoes. So it's just two seasons. And then people will ask me, why do I like the cold so much? Like, well, I've hardly ever been cold while I'm out there. It's a cold environment, but that's when it's at its most beautiful, I think. The routes that I do wouldn't work outside of the winter. It needs to be when the rivers are frozen, when all the swamps and marshes are frozen. So you don't even know that sort of swampy ground is there. But outside of the winter, it would all be impassable. So it has to be done in the winter. When you're moving, you're generating heat, so you're as warm as you could be anywhere else. So the layering system's a little bit different, but I'm only wearing like 4 layers on my top, even if it's minus 50. So I have very rarely been cold, and during the day, not always, but usually you have these perfectly blue skies. The snow is glistening, so it just appears to have crystals in it everywhere. It's silent because the snow absorbs sound, and everywhere you've got prints of all the animals that have been around. So you feel that you're in this wilderness environment, and you do see animals. I've seen a lot when I've been out there. So moose mainly, which are about the most dangerous thing I'll see, but I'll see wolves, occasionally lynx, see quite a few birds, see the occasional rabbit, squirrels and things like that. There's a lot of life around there. I saw caribou when I was out doing the Yukon. So I love that. I love the nature. I love being surrounded by it. I'll tend to travel within a certain limit of comfort that I'm happy with. So I'll have either a single skin tent or just a bivy bag. What I realised is if I'm sleeping in a bivy bag, then I spend a lot of the night with my eyes open, looking at the sky. Often there's the northern lights, so that's absolutely incredible experience. It's amazing to be gazing up and seeing that. And if I'm moving along when there's a really good sort of northern lights show, then it'll be reflected on the snow. So the snow will be kind of green and dancing as well as the sky. So it's an absolutely incredible environment. And I think just from a young age, I've been drawn to nature and the wilderness. There's just this lovely simplicity of walking, just hiking along. The sled is easier than a rucksack in many ways. I haven't got that stress on my shoulders. You know, the gravity is obviously just acting down on the sled. So if I stop moving, there's no tension at all. And if the trail is hard enough because it's cold and there's been some traffic on there, it glides along. It's all very straightforward most of the time. And aside from, a few exciting moments here and there where things don't quite go to plan, the rest of it's really straightforward. And you just this simple life, just every day, all you have to do is walk. And in amongst that, you need to eat, you need to stay hydrated, and you need to look after yourself. It's just this absolute simplicity of life's priorities, and it's wonderful.
Because of the length of it and because of that relative similarity in landscape, I would assume that it's quite easy to forget what you've done on any given day. How did you record what you were doing so that you could write about it later?
So I would have a little digital camera with me. So I'd use that for taking photos or video clips, and I'd occasionally just record sort of diary notes at the end of the day, either using that or using my phone, whichever was to hand, just doing that and doing a little voice recording. I'd do that at the end of each day, and then as soon as the trip was finished, then I'd write out the notes, looking at the route, and yeah, just looking at my photographs as well. And yeah, it was really just that first couple of weeks after getting back where I get all the notes written out, listen to all the voice recordings, and put it together, and then yeah, develop a first draft from all of that.
Are there things that when you get back you think, oh yeah, I remember that, and you'd forgotten completely?
Yes, definitely. And the most obvious kind of example I have of that was actually from one of the races that I did there rather than this big trip. But on one of the races, I got charged by a moose in the last 13 miles of this 430-mile race. And it completely went from my mind. It was obviously very present at the time it was happening. But as soon as the event was over, I somehow forgot about it. And it was when I was being driven back to the start point along the highway and I saw two moose run away from the side of the road, I had this flashback and the whole memory returned to me. But if I'd been sat down at the finish line and asked to do an interview then, it wouldn't have featured because, yeah, you need days sometimes to process it and allow the memories to come back because there's so much going on that a lot of it gets lost. So it takes a while to process.
That's something else that needs some describing as well, is you can't describe to somebody who's never seen one the size of a moose.
Yeah.
They just think it's a horse with antlers, I think. But
Yeah, it's you have to think of a very big Shire horse, or, a dray horse. I mean, they're really big and they can push over like the pickup trucks, and they're so stupid. If they see you on the trail, they will just assume that you're going after them rather than you're moving along the trail. And the reason the moose are on the trail is because it's the easiest surface to move over compared to the very deep snow all around the compacted trail. So yeah, they just become very aggressive, and they're the most dangerous animal. They'll kill more people than anything else up there in the winter, just out of defensiveness. So you see them, you spend a lot of time sitting in snowbanks waiting for them to go by.
like, do you have a plan, or is it more spontaneous in terms of the way that you approach it?
So I suppose when I'm doing it, I'm trying to think about whether it's a day I'm writing about or if it's a section between like cabins or between towns. And I don't necessarily have a structure beyond that. And it will stay quite dynamic because going back to your earlier point, you don't want to kind of write about every meal you're having, but there might be something interesting about a particular meal that makes it worthwhile. So it could be on one occasion during this event, I was sat down at the side of an airfield, and the only thing that would have shown you was an airfield in the winter was just it was very, very flat and compacted, but there was nothing else. I think there might have been maybe something to show you there was a boundary there, but I sat there, I was aware of that, and then the first of the dog teams overtook me. So that was a break worth talking about because things were happening there. But that was a third of the way through. So early on, sort of during the first couple of chapters, I want to get as much across that explains the environment and will help the reader understand what I'm actually doing. And then after that, yeah, it's picking out the points of interest that need to come in that I won't necessarily know in advance. It'll be as I'm putting it all together and thinking about how it flows into other things. And sometimes trying to keep it brief, because if I was trying to describe every single day for 1,000 miles worth of days, then it would be tedious. So it's trying to find what are the really interesting bits, but also how does the flow work? And then the subsequent drafts of me sort of scratching my head and thinking, well, I know what the experience was. Is the reader going to understand it from this? Because there'll be incidents like frostbite where I describe it at the time and how frustrating and angry I was. And then after that, I kind of went back and said, well, now I've just gone back to describing that I'm going along this section and it's a little bit cold, but I haven't mentioned again what I'm thinking about the frostbite and how that's actually the most present thing in my mind for a few days afterwards. I have to kind of go back and revise because it's not just the content. And I wouldn't have written notes about that day to day. I'm still thinking about the frostbite, but I remember it was there. So it's that I want the reader to have as much of an experience kind of similar to my own as possible. I want them to feel that they're kind of with me on the trail and they're having the same sort of thoughts, that they could really put themselves there and think, well, logically, this is what you're thinking. If I didn't have that information, it would be very confusing. Did it just fix itself? Did it suddenly become not a problem? Why aren't you concerned about it?
It's a bit of a chicken and egg question, but do you take on challenges in order to write a book, or do you take on a challenge and then decide that it is going to be a book?
So I do the challenges because that's what I'm passionate about and I love it. And the books are kind of in there because they help facilitate it. It helps me to be able to afford to go back there. It helps people know that this is what I do. So I can use it to help get people on my courses if they want to go out and do the races. So it's all part of it. But it's not as important now because I work full time. I'm not kind of trying to find every little avenue to generate revenue. So it is less important than it was when I was starting out, but it is something that I really enjoy. So I know that for the really big projects, I want to write a book, and I know that there are some people at least who will be very happy to read them. And yeah, at the moment, I've got another book coming out in a couple of months, which is about the Iditarod race. So I did that last year, but it's another 1,000 miler. So one of my kind of claims, or like the story, is that I'm the first person to have done both of those 1,000 mile routes, which is kind of a nice thing. As far as I'm aware, I'm the first person that's done that, the Yukon Quest, on foot. There was a German a few years before me who had gone out there, but for some reason he didn't start in Fairbanks. He started at the next town along and missed a bit. It's a bit weird. I don't kind of shout about it too much because I raced with him. I know him quite well, and I know he's absolutely fit enough to do it. So I'm thinking, well, maybe he just went out a couple of days before and did that section as like a recce, and then he went back to it. But in his book, he just didn't mention doing that, so it seems tenuous. But he didn't do the Iditarod, so I know I'm definitely the first person to have done both of those events. So having done both, it's like, well, naturally, if there's a book out on both of them, then that fits. But I'm going back to the Iditarod again in February, and I don't know if there'll be a book on it because I've already written one on that race. And what I've found in the past is that once I've done something once, I can definitely get a book because what I'm telling is about my view going into it and experiencing it for the first time. So everything's new to me, and that creates an interest. Whereas when I did, say, the Yukon race, the 430 miles, the second and the third time, I might have got a chapter out of it or a couple of chapters, but I wouldn't have been able to do a whole book because I've already written it. I think when I go back to the Iditarod, the difference is that it's 1,000 miles, an awful lot happens. I think it's the most dangerous event in the world as a foot race. And this one is a race rather than like a solo expedition that I did with the Yukon. The last time it was to try and get through and to finish. This time I'm going to go back there to race. So there are some new things, but I don't know yet if it's enough to create a worthwhile book, accepting that some people do just like the yarn and it's something nice to read. So I'll make all the notes and we'll see if it actually becomes a book afterwards. So yeah, I don't know. And I think it's the same with all of them. I'm not really sure, but I create the diary notes and I put everything together. Yeah, say I'd always create the notes when I get back. And I've got that from lots of previous adventures that I've done that haven't become books yet, but they're sat there as the first drafts. Just need to decide if it's a priority.
Yeah, I was going to ask about that, whether there are adventures that you've been on previously that might still become books.
Okay, there are three things that I did that may be worth putting together as books. One was going from my university, Roehampton, when I was doing my PhD, across to Transylvania for a foot race. And I ended up doing a really nice overland journey. It wasn't all on foot. I'd sort of do a section, think, oh, okay, now I know what the north of France looks like. I'm going to jump on a coach or a train and I'm going to skip down to this bit. And now I know what the south coast of France looks like. I'm going to skip across to this bit. And I did that for a couple of months leading up to a race. So I've got all of those notes. I'm not sure if that's worth putting into a book, but I did a paddleboard journey from Big Ben to the Black Sea, which actually ended up integrating a bit of cycling and a bit of hiking as well. Various reasons that I will put into a book at some point. I did a journey in India, which was all hiking. Initially, I was in the south of India, but I went up to Assam and that was an incredible experience. I was a novelty white person walking through rural region of India where people just didn't see white guys, especially the English, for a couple of hundred years. So yeah, that was very interesting. I ended up having to stay in police stations, being collared by the army for potentially being a risk to myself for being in regions that were a little bit dicey. And then whole villages would turn out to welcome me in and show me around tea plantations or set me up at their house for a week and showing me around. That was incredible. So there'll be a book on that at some point. Yeah, it was amazing. Carrying a rucksack, I've already put a drone in there back in the days where drones were big and bulky, thinking, I might get some good content of the jungle and everything with this. And I was turning up places and, oh yeah, please, take this bag of tea. And it would be like a half-kilo bag of tea. Take this back to your mother and father and things like that. And yeah, all these things, the bag's just getting heavier and heavier. And then, yeah, all these tea plantations I was being shown around. But it was great. And walking along Assam, obviously where a lot of black tea comes from, it's in the air, so you smell it. You have sort of the irrigation channels around the tea plantations, so they're all very black. You can smell the tea in them, much like when you're walking around in Scotland, going past some burns in some region, they're very peaty, and then it makes you think, oh, whiskey. You know where the flavours are coming from, and yeah, in Assam it's the tea, and it's in the air.
Any other plans for, other than the Iditarod? Are there other things on the horizon?
Not at the moment. I have to mix things around with my work. I think that this will be the last time I go back to the Iditarod, as long as I finish it. It kind of fits this part of the year when I should really be focusing on teaching. So fortunately, all my colleagues pitch in and they just love to see me doing the race. So they're very supportive, and I'm very lucky with that. But it might be that I turn to do more summer journeys, which will be a welcome treat. And I've always enjoyed doing hikes and so on in the summer, especially all across Europe. So nothing definite, but there will be something.
Does it always have to be a challenge or a race or something like that in order to get you interested?
No, it definitely doesn't have to be a race. That's sort of where I started, and it creates some useful angles. When I went out to do the Yukon, I was really just celebrating that part of the world and that history and that way of existing out there. In these wilderness places where there'd be these lovely log cabins, and go out there and I'd really have that experience, which was completely different to a racing one where you have minimal sleep and you're really just focused on progress. So yeah, it definitely doesn't have to be a race. As for the challenge component, I think it's useful for me to plan around if I know that there's a route and I've got a certain amount of time to do it. If there are any stories, again, sort of local history that gets tied in, that's wonderful. But my Big Bend to Black Sea paddleboarding journey was just to enjoy what that journey would be like on a route that I could put together. So yeah, the Assam journey was not supposed to be in Assam. That was supposed to be in another region of northern India, but I couldn't get there without having a partner with me. So I had a friend who works local government in India, and she was supposed to come with me, but then she got called away on another work project and couldn't, and I wasn't able to go there without another person because of the way the permits worked. And Assam just happened to be somewhere I could get without a permit. So got on a train for something like 5 days to get to the top of Assam, and then just walked south without maps or anything, just worked it out as I went.
The other thing that we need to mention as well is the details on the book and where people can get it, that kind of thing.
Yeah, thank you. So Hiking the Yukon Quest, and it should be in bookshops. Bookshops will be aware of it, but you could just walk into any bookshop and ask them to order it for you. Otherwise, it's on Amazon.
All right, and you have other books are available, as they say. You've got plenty of others as well.
Yes. Yeah, hopefully there's something for everyone, but the Yukon book is the one I'm most proud of.
Obviously, if you listen to the podcast regularly, you'll know I spent most of my adult life in Canada, and people do think it is a frozen wasteland, especially in the north. I can't say I ever really liked that freezing weather though, although mainly I associate winter there with the hour that it took me to clear the driveway and trying to find the car in it and thawing it out so that I could go out and drive on wonderfully icy roads. And then of course the snowplow would go by the end of the driveway and shove half of it back in again. I can feel my blood pressure rising again just thinking about it. Next week, hopefully, we'll be talking about a somewhat sunnier climate and someone doing a long-distance walk in Australia. If you do have news or suggestions for podcast guests, please do get in touch through jim@walkingpost.com. I think this weekend, Saturday, looks decent, so we may be out filming and hopefully it's not too windy, so we can get some aerial footage to go along with the walking. So I hope you enjoyed this week's walkingpost.com podcast, and I hope that you have a great week, hopefully with a walk involved if the weather is good, or even if it isn't. So until next time, happy trails! Walking Post from walkingpost.com is an Air Coastal Media Limited production.